capability of the Catalina that would prove invaluable to the Americans. During the battle, Catalinas would also save the lives of many ditched American flyers. The B-17, a four-engined heavy bomber, had first entered service with the United States Army in June 1939. Although the aircraft would win fame as a strategic bomber, for political reasons the original specification was for a long-range anti-shipping weapon, the role it would in fact play in the Battle of Midway. The B-17E fully lived up to its designation as a flying fortress. Intended to operate in self-defending formations, the B-17E mounted two hydraulically operated turrets, one of them a retractable ball underneath the aircraft. Altogether, the fortress carried 11 machine guns and was fitted with self-sealing fuel tanks and extensive armor. For such a large and powerful aircraft, the B-17 had a low wing loading, and even with heavy combat damage was more likely to get its crew home than any other comparable aircraft. In the Battle of Midway, 19 B-17s of the US Army Air Force would operate against the Japanese. To extend their range, they would carry extra fuel tanks and half their normal bomb load. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had united the American people at a single stroke. Military and civilians alike shared a bitter resolve to see the Japanese totally defeated. Across the country, hundreds of thousands flocked to the recruitment centers. The Japanese blow had been most keenly felt by the men of the United States Navy, and the humiliation had given an extraordinary edge to even the most prosaic of training exercises. Unlike the Japanese, whose trainee naval pilots were an elite, selected at 14 years of age, the Americans recruited from a much wider segment of the population. In the United States, there were far more suitably educated recruits with the right mental and physical qualities for a carrier pilot. On America's entry into the war, the training schools were easily expanded without any appreciable fall-off in quality. After 3 months of elementary flying instruction, the aspiring naval pilot spent another 3 months in basic Navy training. Periods at 2 more flight schools followed, and only the best were then selected for training as carrier pilots. In spite of the excellence of US Navy flight training, American carrier pilots would go into battle with little more than half of the 700 hours flying time acquired by their Japanese counterparts. They had also, as yet, seen little combat. Some had taken part in raids on the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, which had been mounted as much for training and morale as for any strategic reasons. But the actions had been minor and had met little serious opposition. As for flight deck crew, American performance was at least as effective as the Japanese. The men were just as capable of launching a wave of strike aircraft within 5 minutes. Where the Americans did have a real edge on the enemy was in damage control. Damage control parties were highly trained in their duties, and their ability to deal with fire, the greatest threat to any warship, was unsurpassed. At the Battle of Midway, the relative damage control skills of each side would prove a key factor in deciding the outcome of the fight. By late April 1942, preparations for the Japanese campaign were well underway. Naval facilities at the port of Rabaul had been greatly expanded, and thousands of troops had been assembled, ready for the conquest of New Guinea and Tulagi. The troop transports were ready to sail, along with their escorts of cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese anticipated little opposition on Tulagi, and once the island had been captured, the Port Moresby assault would follow. In both cases, the Japanese expected that surprise would be on their side. As the 3 Japanese aircraft carriers which had assembled at Truk prepared to carry out their orders, one to escort the Port Moresby invasion force and the other 2 to take up stations in the Coral Sea, the Americans acted decisively. A task force, based around the carriers Yorktown and Lexington, was sent racing to intercept the Japanese. On May the 1st, south of the Solomon Islands, the carriers rendezvoused with a powerful force of Australian cruisers. The stage was set for the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first clash in an epic confrontation that would change the course of the Pacific War. The capture of the island of Tulagi on May the 3rd, 1942, was, as the Japanese expected, simply a matter of dropping anchor and disembarking the troops. Tulagi's tiny garrison of Australians had already been evacuated. The first blow in Japan's great campaign of expansion had apparently gone strictly to plan. What the Japanese did not know was that the American carrier Yorktown, with Admiral Fletcher on board, had been informed of events on Tulagi and was already steaming north. At 7 a.m. on the morning after the Tulagi landings, Yorktown struck. 40 of Fletcher's aircraft were launched against the anchored Japanese fleet and the occupation force. In a little over an hour, the American bombers and torpedo bombers had sunk or damaged a destroyer, 3 minesweepers, a number of landing craft, and several seaplanes. For the Japanese, it was the first unsettling evidence that American carriers lurked in the area. On only the second day of operations, events were already taking an ominous turn. By the following day, Yorktown and her escorts had returned to rendezvous with Lexington. The 2 escort groups now merged to form a single screen around the carriers. They had joined forces only just in time. The Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, had entered the Coral Sea, and the 2 fleets were just 70 miles apart. On the morning of